When I started a nonprofit years ago, I started with an idea of how I was going to make an impact in the community. I had a general sense of some of the things I was going to have to learn and do in order to be successful. But there were also some parts of the experience of the founder's journey that I wish I'd known a little bit more about before I got started. And if I had to go back in time and talk to my younger self about what it would be like, I would hone in on 4 aspects of the role that knowing about earlier would have helped me be successful. So I want to share some of those things today, and we're going to answer the question, is being a nonprofit founder right for you? Here's the thing. I've learned there are so many ways to make an impact and change the world. And sometimes starting a nonprofit is a great path, and sometimes it's not a path that's going to work best for you. So I really want to talk through my own experiences and some of the conversations that I've had with other nonprofit founders to share 4 things that might help you assess if it's a good path for what you're thinking. Welcome or welcome back. I'm Amber Melanie Smith. I am, as you could have guessed, a nonprofit founder. I'm a former executive director, and I make these videos here on YouTube to help people like you who want to make an impact and are figuring out exactly how to do that. You can check out my library of over 200 videos all about starting a nonprofit, fundraising, social entrepreneurship, social impact, and more on the rest of my channel. I hope you'll also subscribe to my newsletter, which is linked below, because I share how-to guides, actionable tips and strategies, and sometimes opportunities like funding opportunities that can help you in your change making. Finally, check out my website, foundertofulltime.com, for even more resources and some trainings on how to start a nonprofit. All right, I talked about how there are so many ways to make a social impact in the world. So how do you know if starting a nonprofit is the right route for you personally? And when is it a good idea to start a nonprofit instead of pursue one of those other avenues for making an impact? The first indicator that you might be in a good position to start a nonprofit is that you are prepared emotionally and financially to be in it for the long haul, potentially working as an unpaid volunteer for several years. So for this, I would consider your personal situation and think about, do you have other ways of making an income for at least 2 to 3 years without being able to rely on the income from the nonprofit to pay you as an executive director, assuming that's your goal, is to work full-time for the nonprofit. If it isn't, if you just want to start a nonprofit and you aren't hoping to work for that nonprofit full-time one day, then this consideration might not be relevant to you. But assuming you are, you want to make sure that you have other ways of making an income for at least a couple of years. So I know founders personally who were able to make an income as executive director within the first 2 to 3 years, but that's not necessarily the status quo. That's not necessarily commonplace. I also know founders for whom it took 6 to 10 or even more than 10 years to start being able to work full-time for the organization. Some of the founders that I've talked to also shared more about their very first salaries that they had as executive directors. And I can tell you that they're nothing huge, right? They're usually in a low 15,000 to like 40,000 range. And we know that in most cases, that's probably not even enough to pay your bills. It's barely, I don't even think it's a living wage in most places. But just something to consider is that this is a long haul thing. This is the long game, right? If you're hoping to be able to make a competitive salary from the nonprofit really immediately, then you're going to need some pretty big funders who are already willing to write you some checks to get things going. But for most people, that's not the case. Another indicator that you might be in a position to be a nonprofit founder is if you're willing and able to learn skills that you don't have and really put yourself out there. Skills like public speaking, that's actually a really big one for nonprofit leaders, and managing other people effectively is another big one, financial management, etc. And I would consider this a skill, but being resilient to failure, because you might hear no a lot if you are just starting something up. So we often start nonprofits because we're mission driven, right? We want to make a social impact and we want to help others as part of our career. But running a nonprofit is a lot like running a business. And sometimes that means having skills that you might not already have. Things like I said, fundraising, public speaking, leading others. These are all must-haves for anyone who's hoping to be an executive director or CEO of a nonprofit at some point. Some other things that you're going to need to know about, even if you're not an expert in these things, you've got to know at least the basics of accounting and financial management, risk assessment and liability concerns, legal stuff, just the basic, like what are the compliance requirements for running a nonprofit. Knowing how to develop an effective program that's genuinely going to meet the outcomes that it needs to for the community, evaluating impacts, so some analytical skills, some understanding of how to interpret data is really important. So even if one day you outsource these things, you do need a basic understanding of how they work, because you need to be able to know if whomever you've outsourced these things to is doing a good job. And I wouldn't be too discouraged about this. As long as you have a really good attitude around learning and developing your skills as a person, I think you'll be okay. When I started, I didn't know anything about accounting or financial management. I did a college course on nonprofit accounting and learned the basics that way. But it's not like I started with that information. And, I taught myself grant writing. I taught myself some website development so that I could build our first website. You've got to be scrappy in the very beginning as you're trying to find people who are better at these things than you are and getting them on board to take over those tasks. And then, like I said before, you've got to have a thick skin, because when you're starting something new, anyone starting something new, you're going to hear no a lot. That doesn't mean your idea isn't worthwhile. It doesn't mean your cause isn't worthwhile. It just means any number of things. Maybe you asked someone at the wrong time, they were busy or not having a great day. It could mean they're out of funding for the year if you're making a financial request. It could mean any number of things. And for those whom your organization is not a good fit to support, that's okay. You're going to find your people, even if it's not that person. The third indicator that it might be good to start a nonprofit instead of follow some other path to make an impact is that the problem you want to solve in the community that you're serving is something that's going to take a bit of time and some infrastructure. In other words, it's not something that can be solved quickly with a one-time project or campaign. So if you just want to feed one group of people for a day, then you don't need to start a whole nonprofit for that. But if you're trying to end hunger in your city, that might call for a nonprofit with all of its infrastructure and support. Sometimes I get this question from people who just want to do like a fundraising campaign or a special service project for a cause. They ask if they have to start a nonprofit in order to do those things. And the answer, as I've suggested, is no. Starting a nonprofit and going through the whole trouble of setting up the board of directors and the bylaws and all of the policies and the infrastructure and doing fundraising and creating a strategy, like all of that is very robust and complex. And that's what you do if you're setting up an entity for the long haul, for a bigger picture mission. And because the process of starting a nonprofit can be time consuming, I would say, think of starting a nonprofit just like you would think of starting a business. You start a business to meet a need for a customer or solve a problem for a customer. In the same vein, you start a nonprofit when you want to meet a need for a community or solve a problem for a community. So if there's already an existing nonprofit in your same community, your same service area that's doing a great job of that, it might be a better return on investment for you and your time to partner with that organization rather than starting something completely new. There are certainly situations where starting something new and potentially competing with another organization might be really healthy. And there are some situations where it might not be. So it really just depends on the situation and your assessment of, the outcomes that are being met. And the fourth indicator that you might be ready to be a nonprofit founder and start a nonprofit is that you are willing to let your vision grow bigger than yourself, and you're willing to potentially one day give up the reins for other leaders to take up the mantle of the organization even without you. Starting a nonprofit is really not a good fit for someone who needs to be a solopreneur to do things all by themselves. Legally, nonprofits in the vast majority of regions must have a board of directors. So at the very least, you're required to have those people as part of the organization. It's also important to remember that by law, founders don't own the nonprofit either. Even if you start the organization, it's not like you have complete power over what happens to it. If you close the organization, that requires a vote from your board. You can't sell off its assets. You have to give them to another nonprofit. So there are all these legal structures in place to ensure that nonprofits are led by the community and owned by the community as opposed to one person. And your board is going to have voting power. So at the very least, you're going to need to be someone who's very comfortable sharing power and collaborating with other people and being part of a team. And by the way, there's no judgment here if you sound like you are a solopreneur. If you're hearing what I'm saying and you're like, yeah, I really do prefer to do things on my own. No judgment. I have that in me as well. And like I was saying before, there are hundreds of ways to make an impact, and it doesn't have to be through this structure. Nonprofits are just a legal structure. They're not the be all end all of how you change the world and make a difference in your community. But big picture talk here, if you're starting a nonprofit, that means you're trying to solve a problem in your community that is bigger than you. And that means you're going to need to have people bought into that. You're going to need people who are in the community who have experience with the problem. You're going to need people who are skilled in some of the areas you're not skilled, like we talked about before. For example, with me, that would be accounting and so forth. And these problems are bigger than us, and we've got to work together. And a final thought on this, having a team around you that is skilled with each person talented in their own area, and having the buy-in from, your network and your community, that's going to make the organization sustainable, even if something happens to you or you decide to leave the organization at some point. And if you are hoping that the organization will survive many years into the future, then you've got to be sustainability minded, which means creating systems that allow people to lead if you're not there. And I get it, it's hard. I was someone who thought I would never leave the nonprofit that I started years ago, but eventually I did. And it wasn't because I hated the mission or anything was wrong. It was just because I felt a desire to grow in a different way. And I saw that we had great people in place who could carry the mission forward in my absence. So what do you do if you come to the conclusion that being a nonprofit founder is actually not the right path for you? So here's the cool thing. Like I said before, there are so many different ways you can make an impact. You could be a social entrepreneur. You could run for office. You could be a philanthropist or activist. You could also start a socially conscious business and make an impact very similar to the one that you might have been thinking about through a nonprofit, but just with different revenue streams and arguably without the constraints presented by a board of directors. So there are lots of different pathways to get at what you're looking for. And I know I have a lot of content about starting a nonprofit on my channel, but at the end of the day, my ultimate goal is to help you figure out what is the right path for you to make a difference, whether that is starting a nonprofit or doing something else. So I'd love to hear your impressions, what questions were going through your mind as you were watching the video. Do you feel like, yes, nonprofit founder, that's the role for me? Or are you like, maybe I should rethink this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd be really curious to hear what you're thinking. And if you are going to start a nonprofit, check out my website, foundertofulltime.com. Like I said, I've got some trainings and resources up there on how to do that and how to do it sustainably. Newsletter will be linked below the video. And like I said before, that's going to have how-to guides, actionable tips, resources, and funding opportunities for change makers. So you don't want to miss out on that. Don't forget to subscribe. And finally, I have a group on Facebook called Change the World or Bust. We've got thousands of people in there from around the world making an impact each in their own way, and I hope you can join us there. So I'll see you later. This is Amber Melanie Smith signing off. Bye.